Greetings all and welcome to the show. Today's guest will be familiar to anybody who's a fan of Kemetic art or who happens to have seen the rather luscious artwork that graces the cover of my book Profane Egyptologists. Shameless plug. Setken describes his paintings as Nouveau Kemetic, Neo Kemetic and Neo Pharaonic, as these terms speak to the ancient Egyptian themes that his work centres upon, and his contemporary and I must say quite striking take on Egyptian themes as well. But Setken wasn't always an artist. Faced with the crossroads, having been accepted into both the Centre for Performing Arts, now the Helpmann Academy, as an actor, and simultaneously accepted into the Stanley Street School of Art, now the South Australian School of Art, as a visual artist, Setken actually chose the former and began on the road to professional acting. But en route, he also became Mr. Fitness Australia champion, a personal trainer, and even a male striptease performer, before the realisation of a lifelong dream resulted in a trip to Egypt and the re-emergence of his artistic urges. I've been a fan of Setken's art for many years, which is why I chose it for the book cover. But his path to becoming an artist has been deeply varied and interesting. Now, as a side note, I should mention that this was the very first remote, i.e. Skype interview that I attempted. And there were a couple of technical glitches. This resulted in my voice having to be cleaned up and amplified digitally, so I apologise both to you, dear listener, and most deeply to Setken for the audio quality on my side. But thankfully this did not affect Setken's voice quality. So settle in for this two-parter as we explore the theatre of cruelty, shamanic initiations, and Kemetic art. Ladies and germs, I give you Setken.
Setken, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. So I wanted to start off kind of at the beginning, really, to paint a picture of this incredible varied career that you've had that all seems to have led up to this point. And my understanding is that you had a choice between acting and painting when you
Correct.
were at a crossroads, and you were actually offered a place to study both and
Yes.
Ended up going for Centre for Performing Arts. Do you want to get into that?
Crossroads is a very good way to describe it. I had left school and gone into full-time work for one of the record companies. Having loved music and being involved in music for a long time, I thought that that would be my vocation and quickly found that it wasn't. And I had been doing some amateur dramatics with one of the local Adelaide theatre companies and actually found that I really enjoyed it. At the same time, I had been doing art when I was at high school and knew that there was something there, and friends around me at the time who were in the first band that I was in actually had gone to the Stanley Street School of Art and said, look, you should really audition for that as well. So I auditioned for the Stanley Street School of Art and the newly formed Centre for the Performing Arts and got into both and chose acting over art and never lifted a paintbrush again after that until most recently, 6 or 7 years ago, and pursued a career as an actor, which was very short-lived. I did get a couple of roles on TV, like real short roles. Believe it or not, one of my first castings was as a rapist in Australia's Most Wanted.
Oh, wow.
A charming role.
Yeah.
If you knew me, you would. That's the least likely thing I'd ever get cast as. But anyway, that was. So the acting and that training actually helped me later on in my other career as a fitness person and leading classes and coaching people and driving people to their physical best. So that's more or less how the acting gets used these days. Just taking on a different persona and like making sure that people get through a class and get through it well.
Well, I mean, it's a really useful skill set, even though it's a very hard field to break into. And like you, I've actually kind of gone into that field a little myself over the years, and I do hear what you're saying when it comes to the challenges of working in that area and getting castings and auditions is really brutal. But at the same time, it's one of those fields that you find a lot of room for personal and professional growth, and a lot of really interesting transferable skills. And as I understand it, you became a fitness instructor and moved into, bodybuilding to an extent where you became Mr. Fitness Australia champion.
Correct.
Eventually emceeing for fitness events as well, and leading those. So could you tell us more about that and how that journey happened?
Sure. So the fitness thing kicked off actually as a result of the acting. I fancied myself as a, great actor with lines and leading roles and everything, I guess like we all do, particularly when we're younger. But I ended up, like my first roles were actually like spear carrying roles in the opera. So the opera was, the State Opera of South Australia was a very professional and very conservative organisation, and I seemed to be getting supernumerary roles with them. And as I think this is right, I think that one of them was topless. So I forget which opera it was, but we had to do something and we were shirtless, and I had no physique. And that made me want to do something about that. So joined a gym, eventually got onto a gym where they had this new thing that was only for the actors and actresses and the elite of Hollywood called personal training. And there were these 2 people at this particular gym, like amongst the first 10 that were doing it in Adelaide. And I was able to train with one of these and started to really get results. And I thought, well, I like this so much. This is something that I want to pursue. So I did. And at the time, there was no personal training courses as such. So I did the rest of my fitness leaders, got involved in teaching classes and stuff like that, which I had a flair for because of the acting background, but hadn't seen myself as an instructor of aerobics or whatever, but that's indeed what I became. And then eventually got the PT qualifications and started my business, and that's pretty well what I've been doing professionally for a large part of my life. It also allowed me the space to make decisions around how I use my time, which eventually led me to be able to start buying canvases and begin painting again. So I do believe it was all part of that plan.
Yeah, it's funny how we go on these journeys through life not thinking necessarily they're connected to anything or necessarily leading to a certain point, and the wisdom we get in hindsight is if we actually take the time to sit and think back on it, it's really fascinating how it sets us up for our quote unquote real lives as we get there. And before we kind of move on from that performance thing, Antonin Artaud, did I say that right? And the Theatre of Cruelty.
Antonin Artaud.
There we go. I said that totally wrong.
He's French. And I got kicked out of French class when I was at school too, so that's something that I noticed. That. Yes, Antonin Artaud. So when I was at drama school, we had these kind of elective type things that we had to do. And the Theatre of Cruelty came to my attention via our lecturer. And I was very interested in it because of the reference to the car, the double, having already developed an interest in all things metaphysical and particularly Egyptian at a very early age. And there was not a lot of information about Artaud at the time. I remember I had to order this book in that cost a fortune. He was a strange man. I think by the end he went mad. The closest he developed, his form of theatre was called the theatre of cruelty. And the closest theatre of cruelty performance that I've seen was put together by a Spanish company called La Fura del Baus. And I probably didn't say that right because I'm hopeless with other dialects.
We've both got free rein to absolutely murder the pronunciations of everything.
Yes. They came over for one of the Adelaide festivals, and they had used all of the principles that I've read about in the theatre of cruelty. You put the audience in the action, so the audience are actually part of the thing. So this particular thing started with this group of mad people who you assumed were actors. This is all, pre the age of terrorism. Now I don't think they'd be able to do it. And they chased and leapt upon people that we thought were the audience and began tearing their clothes off. And then as soon as they got everything off, they went to the next person. So you're thinking, shit, are they going to do that to me? And the whole thing was based on Artaud's principles. How I can't remember the rest of the performance actually because it was quite some time ago. But I do remember thinking, oh yes, that's how they've incorporated his understanding of the car, because he had this thing that there was theatre itself and then its double, the energy or the etheric that worked through theatre to create its own entity and thing. And I certainly felt that watching that particular performance. One of my favourite bands, Bauhaus, wrote a song called Anton and Artaud. It was on their final old era album, but I think it was the second song on that album, and they covered quite a lot of topics. He had a fascination with the American Indians. They referenced that in the song. The theatre and its double as part of the chorus. Yeah, very interesting man. I did have a theatre company that I kind of inherited very early on, but also in that very early stage realised that it was all about commercialism. And if you want people to come and see your show, it has to be commercially viable and it has to have some sort of popular element to draw people in. And at that stage in sleepy old Adelaide, anything like the Theatre of Cruelty most certainly wouldn't have worked. Interestingly, I'm faced with the same thing now. To be a successful artist, I'm using parenthesis fingers here, you have to sell your paintings, but I'm not particularly keen on going through the gallery system. And my exhibition that I had earlier this year, I rented that gallery. I paid for it all. It was expensive, but I did it all myself. I was in charge of everything. And I'm glad I did that.
And that was a wonderful looking exhibition, actually. And I'm sorry I didn't get to see it with my own eyes, but definitely want to come to that and cover that area. I find that just kind of pulling out a thread from that, the idea of performance encapsulating another level of an internal aspect, so to speak, an energetic level, that in itself is potentially quite an Egyptian concept, in that we have performative aspect of ritual, but we also have the mechanics of ritual, for want of a better term, whilst I'm grasping at that. And it's really interesting that you came to that notion through a almost completely different direction, like it was something waiting to be found for you. Do you find that when you look back at the various things that you've done, that this particular stream of things tying together, does that come from one thing? Like, did you have a fascination for Egypt as a child, or where did that originally come from?
I did. I had that fascination from since I can remember, and it was all through these encyclopedias that Dad had, and it was something that I could connect with my father about, ancient Egypt. We couldn't talk about much else, but we could talk about that. He was as fascinated with that as I was. Interestingly enough, one of the years at school, my education was all Catholic, and which is the reason why I'm constantly searching for fun now, because it certainly wasn't fun doing that. But I do remember one year we had, for religious education, we were allowed to explore comparative religions, which I couldn't imagine happening now. And how it got under the radar at that particular school, I don't know. But I do remember my Egyptian and Hindu projects, and just I was more fascinated with Egypt than any of the others and couldn't really let it go. It only occurred to me some years later when I wanted to go back into the church of my childhood, because I remembered some stained glass windows and I wanted to get photos of them, because I think I was working on The Artist is Beloved of Heroine Set at the time, and I wanted to try and get a stained glass window effect somehow into that, which didn't come off in the end. So I went back to the church and was struck by a number of things. But one of the main things was on the pulpit, and I articulated this in a blog post, there were 4 beings, 3 of which were animal-headed. They were human bodies, animal heads. And I found out later from that blog post that these are the 4 gospel saints. But each of them was represented by a particular animal and one by a human. And whoever the artist was for this pulpit, it was very Egyptian, actually. Mm-hmm. These 4 winged beings, humans, one with the head of a cow or a bull, the other with the head of an eagle, and the third one I can't remember, and a human one. And I remember always being fascinated with that because we had to go to church every week. And that was my point of focus rather than everything else. The other stuff I couldn't make sense of, but that held my fascination. So that, I think, kind of spurred things along a little bit as well. And it wasn't, I guess, until I had my New Age awakening that the more esoteric side of Egyptian stuff became available to me. I began going to the free lectures at the Theosophical Society in Adelaide. They had a free lecture every Sunday night, and I went no matter what. I suppose it was a replacement for going to church, I guess. And between their bookshop and a bookshop next door called Cosmic Pages, I was able to explore all of this esoteric Egyptian stuff that I hadn't known about. Mm-hmm. The works of Helena Blavatsky, for example. Yes. Mona Rolfe was another one. Schwaller de Lubitsch, mm-hmm. although that at the time was very intense for me, and I still struggle to grasp some of that stuff. But that's his work and his wife's work have been quite major as far as my understanding of much of Egyptian spirituality, symbolism, and soul anatomy goes. So it all kind of went from there, actually. Then there was the Lion Path after that, and further down the track. Am I going too fast?
Actually, I wouldn't mind pulling on a thread there, actually, that the Schwaller de Lubitsch mentioned there. Interestingly, that was one of the earliest sources of non-Egyptological material that I read as well. And I came across his work, I think, when I was about the age of 18, 19, something like that. And I was in a bookshop in London.
Actually.
Yeah.
I was that age too.
It's interesting, isn't it? I picked up a copy of Herback.
Yeah, right.
Volume 2.
Yeah.
And I did notice on the blog post when you were talking about the inspiration for material immortality, when you mentioned the cover by Lucy Lemmy,
Psychostasia, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Then I realised, wow, yes, of course. And you said that subconsciously influenced your painting on that piece, which I can see now that I look at it. And I will put links to these paintings, because obviously this will end up being quite a visual tour when we get to some of the artwork. And I will put links to these blog posts in the show notes so that people can check these out, and I encourage them to do so. Yes, it's a really, for anyone who's kind of come across Shvala de Lubitsch, it's a deep and symbolic take on the not just the religion, but also the mindset and philosophy of the ancient Egyptian culture. And it's a really, really intriguing and unique take that he took an entire lifetime to develop, and was very quickly dismissed by contemporary Egyptologists as being, the kind of fringe material of his era. That being said, I know that when I was writing papers on symbolism and architecture, harmonic proportion, which is something I'm sure you're very familiar with, being an artist, and things like that, I would always reference these works to see what kind of feedback I would get from my supervisors and examiners to see if they'd read them. What was there anything in particular? I mean, I'm always curious about people's first experiences when they're exposed to these ideas. What was it like when you first opened one of those books? How did it feel? What was the experience like for you?
Well, now I'm interested to know what your supervisors what they saw him reference there. Well, her Bark 1 and 2 were the first two that I read, and I remember at the time that I found them a little dense, and I think I now know in retrospect, anything that's been translated from another language into English has that.
Yeah.
There's something about unless the translator is exceptional, there's always going to be that kind of a grinding of the gears in telling the story. So I found her Bark to be like that. But I also found it to be extremely fascinating. And it informed, a lot of my understanding of the more esoteric side of ancient Egypt from the get-go, right back then. I got The King of Pharaonic Theocracy, which was R.H. Waller's one of his masterworks, and I think I got a quarter of the way into it and had to put it down. It's still on the bookshelf. It's something I do want to read. And I think I attempted a paperback version of The Temple in Man. I remember thinking that what really stood with me from R.A.'s work was what you mentioned earlier about the fact that the Egyptians had such a different mindset to us, and unless we can adopt that mindset, we're not going to understand what it is the hieroglyphs say. Now, as I've become more involved with painting these hieroglyphs, I try and switch part of my brain off, that intellectual part, and try to let the hieroglyphs speak to me, and they do. And sometimes, as freaky as this may sound, I'll look at a painting and it will start moving. Something on the canvas will start moving. Not in a big way, just enough that I'm thinking, shit, am I hallucinating or what? And occasionally it's hieroglyphs, sometimes it's the figures in the painting. I guess until you see the final tomes that R.A. made before he died, that came out in big books. I saw a copy of them in the Rosicrucian Museum Library when I was over there. And
there's the Temple in Man and the Temple of Man, isn't there? That was one of the big ones.
Yeah, I can't remember if it was that or another one, but looking at the detail of his line work and how much information he had recorded, I mean, just on the level of making a record of these artifacts alone, the guy should be awarded much more a place in Egyptology than he currently gets. But that book was quite astonishing to look through. I ended up taking some photos of it because there were some images of Set that I hadn't seen before,
Mm-hmm.
that were on the inside of some of the pylons they'd tumbled over or something,
Yeah.
that he had recorded. I just wish that there was a way that I could get my brain around some of the stuff that RA was writing about, but it may have to come from another part of me and not my brain, I'm thinking.
I absolutely know what you mean by that, and I must confess, I've even just making it through Hebak, Volume 2, has been a major undertaking several times in my life. You know, just trying to penetrate that text. And the one thing I found was that if I just tried to digest it in small bits, there was so much just in 1 or 2 pages to kind of mull over about the Egyptian mindset and trying to get ourselves there. And it's something that concept of trying to understand the Egyptians on their own terms is something that, you know, is starting to be increasingly recognized in Egyptology itself, thankfully.
Right.
Whether or not, you know, the field en masse will eventually come round to recognizing or acknowledging his work in that area, I don't know. I think possibly he's been kind of labelled as fringe for such a long time that it would be a very difficult thing to, I don't want to use the term redeem him from that, because I don't think he needs redemption, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do know what you mean. Yeah.
Reincorporate into the body of knowledge. But I do encourage people to take at least a passing look at Schwaller's work and just get an idea what he was about rather than just dismissing it, because I think that's an important thing for us to do with these kinds of things. And I know that people like, and this is going off topic slightly, but you know, John Anthony West was very into the work of Schwarzkopf, and unfortunately, I think a lot of the discussion gets distracted into the Age of the Sphinx issue rather than looking at the way that he analysed RA's work on the different temples and on the and you know the Anthony West's Traveller's Key to Ancient Egypt is a wonderful book to travel Egypt with, if only because he covers the Egyptological quote unquote accepted material, but he also covers the symbolic material, so it's there if you need it, you know. But I'll move on before I start sounding like an advert for the Traveller's Key and Scholar de Lubis. But coming back to what you're talking about there, though, the idea of the symbolic mindset and starting to understand this esoteric version of Egypt, and eventually it seems you've kind of travelled towards an Egyptological interface, so to speak, with Egypt as well, in your exploration of the hieroglyphs and exploration of the artistic forms. These are things that you know, there's a lot of really fruitful crossover in all of these areas. Was there anything about Egyptian art itself? I mean, you mentioned these; they almost sound like canopic jars that they had in the church, with the jar with the animal head that's traditionally used for.
Oh, well, it was a pulpit, and the decoration was on one corner, two faces of the corner of the pulpit.
Yeah.
That's what they were. The church was St. Joseph's in Brighton, Adelaide, South Australia.
Okay.
And it's on my blog anyway. It's on an early blog post I did when I visited Adelaide one Christmas. I took a photo and put it up, and it was actually one of my blog followers who I have occasional interaction with on online. Sarah, she actually pointed out to me that it was the four gospel guys. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, that's who they are, and that they were traditional symbols that I hadn't known about.
And it's interesting how when Constantine declared Christianity the religion of the realm, so to speak, and a lot of these older traditions had to be folded in to try and bring the populace into the idea of, well, you know, we'll keep the stuff that you're used to a degree, but we're going to call it this now. And, Isis and Horus become, Mary and the baby Jesus. It's very, very famous image of, the Isis statue nursing Horus is almost identical to the Mother Mary and Jesus statues we see around the world. And you see this incorporation ultimately has led you back to the source. Some of these incorporations have led you back to the original.
Well, it's interesting. It was that actual point of transition that got my attention. That first, I've only been to Egypt twice, and the first time was at the very end of 2010, so about a month before the revolution, and I only went to Cairo. And I remember seeing, I think it was in the Coptic Museum, I'm pretty sure it was, and a very recognizable Christian piece of art. So I don't know whether it came from a coffin, I can't remember, or if it was a shroud, or if it was something that had been hung up in a church. But it was traditional Christian, what we now know as traditional Christian iconography, but Inpu, Anubis, was featured. And that stuck with me to the point where I wanted to explore that. I started to think about how could it have happened that this thousands and thousands of year old civilization with these gods and culture all of a sudden, quite clearly it wasn't all of a sudden, there was a transitional point from the old Kemetic religion into Christianity. That's what initially caught my interest artistically. I've always admired Egyptian art and sculpture from the get-go. It's always fascinated me why they chose the colours they chose, why the Neem's headcloth is striped, why they use the Pharaonic beard and all these sorts of things. But it was seeing that particular piece that made me think about this transition from one era or one religion into the other. And I started to want to explore that when I got back home. And that's more or less how it all started, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's how you came to the Kemetic art. And before we get on to that, and I do want to dive into that, because I've done a deep dive into the world of your art over the last several years, but particularly intensely over the last week as well. So I've got lots of questions I want to ask about that. But speaking about transitions, I'm really interested because you mentioned Dr. Charles
Musaeus.
There we go. I'm going to murder every pronunciation that I come across of names. I'm terrible at them.
Well, with that one, he also had a pseudonym of Musaeus.
Right.
So his name, and he had other pseudonyms as well. So you could be forgiven for that, Paul. I mean, I forgive you for it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
He's a really interesting character because he was a student of philosophy, eventually a doctor of philosophy and an academic.
Yeah.
And he was really interested in the idea of am I getting this right, the higher body and the immortal self and transitioning between these stages. And he looked to Egypt for those things.
Yes.
But something that I hadn't realized, that you'd actually informed me of this, and I had no idea, was that he'd also discovered a pyramid.
Yes.
The pyramid of Amenemhat, is that?
Yeah. And as I pointed out to you, I think in one of our email correspondences, they had just found recently, like within the last 4 or 5 weeks, a portion of some sort of temple wall related to that pyramid of that same pharaoh. I do believe that Aidan Dodson, I want to say, had written a fair bit about that pyramid and about Charles Musaeus discovering it, because there was controversy around what happened afterwards. As far as I knew, he was an Egyptologist. That was another one of his disciplines. And whilst the lion path, which he founded or rediscovered, was primarily based on Egyptian texts, it did actually, he said, bring in elements of Tibetan Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't read the stuff for a while. I do believe that there was some Hindu theology in there as well.
Yeah, yeah. I took a bit of a dive into his world, actually, after you mentioned him. And some really interesting stuff there, particularly when he's talking about, I think he was on a show talking about particle physics, speaking about how, particles, you get these wave packets, and human beings really are just standing waves. Our bodies are like fountains renewed every minute of particles. And he goes into the nature of time and space, and how time can encapsulate all of space and space cannot encapsulate all of time. And you can see how he goes from the physical and the physics into the metaphysical, clearly one of these big lateral thinkers in many ways.
Right.
The lion path itself, I'm kind of curious about this. I took a flick through the book, and the lion path is to be distinguished from two other paths, and these he talks about with reference to 3 couches found in King Tut's tomb. And that was really interesting to me, because he's talking about, is it the hippo path, the lion path, and...
the cow path.
The cow path, that was it, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the lion path, just for anyone who's not familiar with that concept?
So the lion path was a guarded secret, he said, that was really the key and the clue to immortality. If one was traveling, if their soul was on the lion path, they were on the path of immortality and non-destruction and non-reincarnation. The lion path itself outlines, with all kinds of mathematics and physics and other strange pieces of science that were beyond me then and now, how this could happen with a human being with a kind of self-development process, I guess a kind of self-therapy, putting yourself through self-development. But he also devised this, they were cassettes, of sound that you had to listen to at certain times of the day, on a particular day, aligned with a particular cycle that you were on, and they all ceased sometime in the late 90s, to help with this, what he called the higher metamorphic process. The sounds were basically synthesizer sounds, but they were kind of trippy, and he'd hold a note for about, 10 seconds, and another note would come on, and you were meant to meditate and be bathed in that vibration. And I think he referenced somewhere in the books that this is what the sound chambers in the pyramids were used for. I think he said that. I can't remember. I might have seen that somewhere else. But anyway, he did reference sound and vibration as part of the key to this metamorphic development. And all of the symbolism of a mummy being like a cocoon, and winged creatures emerging like a butterfly, winged creatures or deities being the higher form of the human pupa.
Yeah.
All of this was outlined throughout the book. It was the lion path, and then he did another 2 after that.
And for all of the Egyptologists out there who are sitting there going, wow, these guys have gone into, woo-woo territory, I would actually like to pull it back and say that, first of all, this is actually a concept I've come across in other places, from very different sources, about this search for immortality and the symbolic attainment of higher selves. That's I think, something that we can accept as something the Egyptians were very interested in themselves, irrespective of how we might apply it to our own lives. But also another point is that Dr. Charles himself was really interested in neurochemistry and believed that this sound technology would help in the freeing of neuropeptides that were key in opening up different aspects of the brain's capability in layman's terms, correct?
Right, right.
So he was coming at it from a scientific point of view as well.
Yeah. I've since watched, I've become very interested in that whole lion path thing again in recent times. And I've found these videos on YouTube of Charles, and I want to get his book, Destiny and Control in Human Systems. It also needs to be pointed out that he founded a stream of mathematics that is still highly regarded today as a form of higher mathematics that's actually very difficult to understand. So the guy wasn't an idiot. And I accept that some of the things that he said and were exploring we may consider as fringe now, but there were other things that he was discovering and presenting that were really pushing forward in other areas of science that are still respected today. I forget the name of the stream of mathematics. It's on his Wikipedia page. Yeah. It's very easy to find. And of course, he did discover that pyramid. His building, he made a house for himself. I forget the state in America where it was. It was called Falcon Ranch. It's since been sold. Apparently it was built with all of these harmonic principles that we mentioned before.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And apparently someone said that they saw him walking through walls. So he was up to all kinds of interesting stuff, that man. And who knows, he may be the subject of a painting further down the track.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, coming around to the idea of these transitions, you know, you say you were exposed to ideas of theosophy and Blavatsky and stuff, but there's still quite a leap there, from my understanding of that to Kemeticism as it's widely practiced, or increasingly widely practiced today. So where did that change occur? Could you tell us the story of how that came about?
Well, I think it actually occurred in Egypt when I made that visit to Cairo in 2010. Again, like the other story I told earlier, I was over in that part of the world doing something else. It was to do with a fitness brand I was working for at the time, and I thought it was in Italy. So I thought I'm that close to Egypt. It was a lifelong dream. I'll spend a week there before I come home. So I did that, and I only stayed in Cairo. And I think that changed me or activated something in me that I was not able to turn away from. That first trip to Egypt, and I've only done two, apart from it being a country, a Middle Eastern country, and I'd not experienced that before, there was something about it that seemed to resonate or unleash or echo something in me that I don't think that I was over there looking for. I was over there to indulge a lifelong fascination in Egypt, not necessarily a fascination with any one particular aspect. I knew that I wanted to go inside the pyramids, but I think being over there, and even though it is no longer a Kemetic country, that constant reminder of religion with the call to prayer or every few hours, and the reverence that the people have for their religion. Perhaps it was that also triggered something while I was there.
And that was one of 2 trips, correct?
Correct.
And on the second trip, 2 years later, was it?
It was longer than that. It was about 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
And that trip came about because the Department of Antiquities had lifted the ban on using cameras in the Cairo Museum.
Mm-hmm.
So for a short period, which happened to coincide with the Western Christmas, you could go and take photos of whatever you wanted in the Cairo Museum. So I took advantage of that. That statue of Set, the one that I did my painting of, Spiritual Insomnia, that was one of the main reasons to get photographs of that particular part of that 3-part statue from different angles to create that painting. That was one of the main things. But that trip, I didn't just stay in Cairo. I went down to Luxor and then Aswan. And I think I went to Saqqara. I did a whole lot more in that trip than that first one.
It's very interesting because having undertaken quite a lot of research with people's first experiences of Egypt over the years, that's something that comes up numerous times, as the idea of actually being there, being an awakening process, and something, an idea becomes more alive, for want of a better term, particularly on a first trip.
I remember being out on the sun deck of the pool at the hotel I was staying in, and just thinking, well, this is Ra. This is the famous Ra that I'm sitting under here. And starting to think things like that I hadn't thought before. And then when I got home, a particular book, I forget how I came across it, just wouldn't get out of my head, and I had to end up buying the bloody thing, and that had led into what we now see with this real, I wouldn't even say immersion, it's gone beyond that, of Kemeticism and art that is what we have with the Setken we see today.
And what book was that?
It was called the Anubis Oracle, a shamanic Egyptian oracle by Nikki Scully and Linda Starwolf. And initially when I saw it, I was a bit skeptical about it. And there was a card deck, an oracle deck that went along with it. And I bought it and I went through the meditation/initiations that were outlined, and things really started to leap out for me. And that was an initiator for me. And an interesting Inpu being the guardian of the gate and everything, that would be the name of the oracle.
Inpu being Anubis, more widely known as Anubis to listeners who aren't familiar with the Egyptian terminology.
Getting involved with Kemetic ritual and seeing how that works and how there's an actual technology involved was a completely different thing and an eye-opener. It was that trip actually to America where I first really got involved with Kemetic ritual. There were some prayers that we did at Batamasu's place in West Wendover at his shrine. And then when I went down to San Jose for Pantheacon, there was the Kemetic Temple of Ra's ritual for Bast that I participated in. And that was further on down the track from the period we were talking about before. But by then, a lot of that skepticism had been dissolved through personal experience to find otherwise.
Something I find really interesting about your particular journey is that because you're out in Australia where the Kemetic community is perhaps not as populated necessarily in Australia as it is in some parts of the United States. So your exposure to those movements and to that community, I think, has been quite unique in that you came at it from quite a different perspective, perhaps, in some ways. But equally, I mean, where did you first hear of the Kemetic movement? What was your first exposure to that?
Well, probably through that book, Nikki Scully and Linda Starwolf's book. And then as I began to explore online, I came across Patamasu's iconography work and his temple in Nevada, eventually Richard Reedy and the temple of Ra and the one in San Jose, Tamra's House of Nature. There were others as well that I found online, and in those early days had interaction with many different individuals and communities, but it wasn't long-lived. I don't really enjoy internet communication. I find that the nuances of conversation and body language and participating in a conversation are lost, and it is easy for meanings to get skewed, etc. As far as there being a Kemetic community in Melbourne, I know that there are Kemetics here. I met two of them at my exhibition. One of them wrote a really lovely review of the exhibition, actually. And the other one, I had seen some stuff online before, but actually thought he lived in America. And then I saw them at the exhibition, and that was it.
Yeah.
Never saw them again. And that's kind of a bit what it's like for me. In some ways, it would be great to be able to have, Kemetic pals and stuff like that. But I have to be realistic. I have a full-time job, and when I'm not working, I want to paint. So I don't want to become completely socially retarded, but I kind of have become that, to be honest, because I just, the drive to paint overwhelms that desire for social interaction. And I'm sure there's lots of lovely people out there for me to meet, but it's going to mean that I don't make art.
Thank you for listening, folks. That's all we have time for on this episode, but check back in for part 2, which may already be winging its way towards your speakers online now. I've been Paul Harrison, and you've been listening to the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Thanks again, guys. Take care up there.